It's time to talk about the book of Job. And the book of Job sucks. It's a terrible book, but I suspect it's one of those books that Christians have learned to read, if they read it at all, in a way that glosses over its difficulties. The dating of the book is tricky. Estimates range from the period of the patriarchs in the 2nd millennium BCE to the Hellenistic period in the 3rd to 2nd century BCE. Because of the similarity of the role of Satan here to that in the book of the prophet Zechariah, which is probably post-captivity, I'm inclined to date it sometime shortly after the return from captivity in Babylon in around 538 BCE, so sometime after that. It's probably not that important for my purpose here. I'm also inclined to think that the story is not intended to be an actual historical account featuring a real man called Job. Rather, I think it's intended to be a kind of didactic poem, a story written to teach a lesson. There's nothing in the story to anchor it to any specific place or time, which is why it's so difficult to date. There may have been a figure in literature called Job. Ezekiel mentions a righteous man by that name, but this story is probably fictional, intended to be fictional. Let's take a quick look at this delightful story. The story begins with Job, a wealthy and righteous man who lives in the land of Uz, which no one can actually identify. He's described as blameless, upright, fearing God, shunning evil. He has a large family, lots of livestock, and he's highly respected within his community. After we've been introduced to Job, the scene shifts to heaven, to a divine council that's taking place, where God praises Job's righteousness. Satan, the accuser, challenges Job's integrity, arguing that Job is only faithful because he's prosperous, he's doing okay, and he's being protected by God. Satan suggests that if all of Job's blessings were actually taken away, he would curse God. So, God allows Satan to test Job's faith, but he forbids him from actually harming Job physically. So Satan brings calamity upon Job. God doesn't get his own hands dirty, of course. He gets his servant Satan to do all the dirty work. So Job's livestock is all stolen or destroyed, his servants are killed, all of his children die when a house collapses on them. But despite these overwhelming losses, Job doesn't sin, he doesn't curse God, but instead he expresses his profound grief, saying, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." So Satan then pops back up to the heavenly court and argues that Job's faith will certainly falter if his health is taken away. So God permits Satan to afflict Job with all these terrible sores from head to toe. But even in his pain and misery, all his suffering, Job refuses to curse God, though obviously he does lament his suffering and he wishes for death. Then three friends of Job's pop along. Let's call them Mo, Larry and Curly. They come along to comfort him, and they engage in a series of dialogues and debates, arguing that suffering is a result of sin. So they're implying that Job must have done something. He must have sinned in some way to deserve such terrible punishment. But Job continues to insist on his own innocence and says that he's confused about why the wicked prosper but the righteous suffer. He challenges the notion that his suffering is deserved, and he questions God's justice. It's interesting here that the author of Job seems to explicitly reject one of the arguments that is sometimes put forward by Christians to explain suffering in the world, namely that it's a consequence of sin, that it's God's punishment for sin. Well, here, that's expressly denied. Then a fourth figure comes along, let's call him Elwood. He enters the discussion. He argues that suffering may be a way for God to teach or refine people rather than as a punishment for sin. So there's another idea that's sometimes bandied around, that suffering is actually a way of teaching us, helping us to grow up, to grow stronger. But still Job refuses to curse God. And eventually God pops down from heaven, appears in a whirlwind, and he addresses Job. And he throws a whole lot of rhetorical questions at Job that highlight God's power, the limitations of human understanding. The gist of all this is that God has big plans. He's done all these great things, like creating the world. And he goes on to list all his great achievements to show how much greater he is than mere humans who couldn't possibly understand. He berates Job for questioning God's justice, and on it goes. He doesn't answer Job's questions about suffering, merely implying that the question is impertinent. So Job humbly acknowledges that God is great, and he acknowledges his own lack of understanding. Then God rebukes Job's buddies for their incorrect assumptions about suffering and rewards Job's faithfulness. So God basically dismisses all these explanations for suffering, including that it's a result of sin, that it's a punishment for sin, including that it's a way of teaching his people, educating his people. He dismisses all of these ideas. It's all too much for human beings to understand. So once Job humbly acknowledges how wonderful God is and how he can't possibly understand anything, then Job's fortunes are restored. He receives double what he had before in the way of material possessions. He has some more children, and he lives a long, prosperous life. Too bad about all those servants and Job's other children who all had to die so that God could prove his point. But I guess they were just collateral damage. They were just property anyway, easily replaced. So the book of Job seems to wrestle with the question of why the righteous suffer. At least that's the question Job is asking. And it challenges any simplistic explanations of suffering, whether that's as a punishment for sin or as a mode of education. It ultimately suggests that human beings cannot fully understand God's ways, and they just must trust in his wisdom, which of course is always the fallback position of Christians as well today. We just don't understand. The picture's bigger than we could possibly comprehend. It's too much for our little brains. But the Lord gave me all this stuff, so he can take it away any time he likes. It's a bit like the way you own, but don't actually own, the books that you've bought from Amazon and stored on your Kindle or some other device. Just as Amazon can actually take them back anytime they like, so too God can take away anything he's given you, which of course is everything. As Job says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." So God refuses to answer the basic question, why do the righteous suffer? Simplistic answers such as suffering is a result of sin, suffering is a method of teaching, these are dismissed. It's far too complicated for us mere mortals to understand. Don't question it. To question it is impertinent. The irony is, though, that the book of Job actually makes it absolutely clear why Job, this righteous man, suffers. It's precisely because he's righteous. Satan challenges this assessment, arguing that Job is, in terms Christians sometimes use with reference to other Christians, saying that Job is a fair weather devotee. He's only faithful because life's good for him. Take all that away and see what happens. So God lets Satan strip Job of all his wealth, of his children, just to prove a point, that he is genuinely righteous and faithful. And so he is, up to this point. But that's not good enough. So God lets Satan push Job even further, inflicting him with illness, with all these horrible sores, and then afflicting him with annoying friends. But still, Job refuses to curse God. He remains faithful. Sure, he asks some impertinent questions, but he doesn't curse God. He remains faithful. Let me pose this question. What would have happened to Job if he had cursed God? Would it be worse than what actually happened to him? How? How could it be worse? Maybe God would have destroyed him. Well, good. Job expresses the desire to die. That would be preferable. All we get from God by way of answer to Job's question is his puffed up ego. Look how great I am. Stop whining. But we do know why Job is suffering. It's because he's righteous, and therefore has to go on proving over and over and over and over again that he is in fact righteous and faithful no matter what happens. But I'm with Job's wife on this one. When Job takes a piece of broken pottery and tries to scrape off his sores, yes, I know it's a horrible image, but it's right there in the Bible. She says to him, "Do you still hold on to your faith? Curse God and die." And remember, just as an aside, that everything that's happened to Job up until his actual physical affliction, all these sores and so on, this has happened to his wife too. She's lost everything too. She's lost all their possessions, she's lost her children, but nobody cares about her. Maybe she was lucky enough not to be righteous and have to prove herself. She wants Job to curse God, and presumably that means she thinks he should be cursed. And it results in no more ill for her than she's already experienced. Job's answer to his wife is, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Should we receive good from God and not receive trouble?" Yes. Yes, exactly. We should expect to receive good from God and not trouble. God should be faithful and true and trustworthy, just as he expects his children to be. It should be a two-way relationship. God should not arbitrarily take away, and it is really just completely arbitrary here. He shouldn't just take away what he's previously given, just to test us. That is horrendous. No one should trust a God like that. Job should indeed curse God and die. It would be far better than what he actually suffers for the sake of his righteousness. This God, the God at least that the writer of this educational text reveres so much, this God sucks big time. He deserves to be cursed and denied.